Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm recording a podcast and I am live streaming this on Instagram. So welcome everyone. This is a live episode 277 of the Mom is in Control podcast. So if you are not already a listener, watching this on Instagram, listening live on iTunes or wherever you typically listen to your podcast. If you're a podcast listener, then head on over there. And if you are a podcast listener, please rate and review the podcast. Just head on over to iTunes and check it out. So instead of getting distracted by Instagram, I'm going to look down so I'm not looking at your comments or messages, and we're going to jump right in. Today I wanted to talk about how to make disease disappear. I was listening to a podcast episode on the Rich Roll podcast. So if you are not familiar, go check him out. That is Rich Roll podcast. Amazing human being. I started I started listening to Rich a few years ago. And I remember when I was going through my cancer and recovery journey. And I had this ache for more. I had this ache to start running, to start doing more physical exercise. And as I call them, breadcrumbs, these breadcrumbs that were leading me back to myself. And Rich Roll's podcast was one of those. What I also love about him is he has his own personal health journey. But he talks a lot about food and food healing your body and healing your mind. And I just think it's really magical. And also that we don't know this information, that it's not common knowledge. So today I was listening to an episode with Dr., and I'm going to say his name wrong, Rangan Chatterjee. I totally am not saying that correctly. So go check out Rich Roll's latest podcast. And it's titled How to Make Disease Disappear. So that's the title of this doctor's book. And he's a really, really cool guy, down to earth. And, he was telling his own personal stories, his own family traumatic trauma that they've been through. But one of his stories that he was really hit home for me was when, he's a practicing physician. And I think when his son was 6 months old, something happened. They were on vacation and he got very, very sick. And they didn't know what it was. And he almost died. And in that moment, he wasn't doctor. He was dad, and he was a very overwhelmed dad and didn't really understand what to do. And, in that moment when it's your child, it's very, very different. So they went to the hospital, and in the hospital, they told him he had a calcium deficiency. And that's kind of why he had the reaction that he did, where he kind of just seized up and froze. And I'm not a physician, so I don't understand the technical terminology. You'll have to definitely listen to that podcast. But what I really liked was he had this guilt, and he felt so guilty of, why couldn't I figure this out? Why, if it's just a vitamin D deficiency, why isn't anybody telling us this? Because he lives in the UK and this wasn't common knowledge, common practice when you have children to give them vitamin D. And so what is very interesting to me is how, from his own personal trauma and these things that happened in his own personal life, he was able to utilize that pain and discomfort of feeling so guilty for almost losing his son when he had or has this medical education background. And he got into, trying to do research and getting into this, of realizing that this thing that happened to his son could have been prevented with more awareness and knowledge and integrative medicine. And I'm over here going, yes, but who am I, right? Nobody's going to listen to me. I'm not a doctor. And more, as I dive into this world of proactive health, meaning proactive mental health, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health, I see so many people struggling. I talk to these women about themselves and their own anxieties and overwhelms and dis-ease, right? Dis-ease in their life, whether it's with them or their children. And they'll say, we went to the doctor and the doctor said this, and, we're put on this medical protocol, And I was like, great, that's symptom management. And that's awesome. I'm not against medicine. I mean, medicine has saved my life, but it does what it does. And realizing that, it's not the medical system. Yes, they do have a lot of power, and they definitely need to, to change that system. But we as individuals need to take responsibility for our health. And when you have children, you need to take responsibility and think outside of the box when it comes to understanding your children's health and well-being. And I want to give you an example of this. So I talk a lot about this on the podcast with my own health background and, having stage 4 cancer, and Western medicine saved my life. I put myself off for so long that, all the symptoms that were there, I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't listening to my body. And I had to get, Western medicine treatment intervention. But, after that, after the symptoms are managed, it's like we don't have anything else for you, and that's okay. You kind of move on. So when it came to recovery, I was on my own, and I had to figure out, how did I get cancer in the first place? Like, what actually happens in the body to allow cancer cells to grow? And I learned so much about diet and exercise, and realizing that just a little bit of exercise every day and eating clean and reducing my caffeine and drinking more water, that alone, right? Like no fast food, very little sugar, drastically shifted my anxiety, where before I would have had to been on antidepressants or anxiety medication. And there's so many lifestyle shifts that we have to take to allow the disease in our life to be to get back into alignment. And so as this guy was talking on the podcast, like I said, I'm going, yes, yes, yes. And he was telling a story about one of his patients, 16-year-old boy, came in and was really struggling, actually tried to harm himself, and he was in the hospital. And while he was trying to harm himself, obviously he went to the doctor after, and they're like, okay, can you please, they made a note, the hospital made a note, can you please, put him on antidepressants and do that whole protocol? He's like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. He goes, but there's more here. So he actually made more time for him, and he started implementing lifestyle shifts, like decreasing his screen time and helping him change up his diet, right? Teens typically don't eat that well, and just getting outside more. And slowly, he had life again, right? His life was brought back into him. And too often, we're looking around us saying, who can solve my problem for me? How can I, No, we're not asking how can I. We're asking who can, right? So instead of asking who can, ask how can I? And too often we're not taking the action. So I talk a lot about inspiration versus transformation. And inspiration is when you are inspired, when you're actually motivated, right? Sometimes not to take action so much, but you're actually motivated, you're inspired, you're like, ooh, that felt good. Transformation is what happens after you take those actionable actions. My dog might come in here in a sec. I can feel him or hear him go crazy. Transformation is this magic that happens. There's so much discomfort that happens when we are transforming our bodies and our minds and our souls. And so what I loved about this conversation as well that Rich Roll was having with this physician on his podcast is he talked about the importance of actionable steps, right? Just like the story that I was telling about that boy that he was working with. He's like, let's just work on taking your, putting your phone away an hour before bed. And there's a quote that he said, getting people better doesn't come from scientific papers. It's about creating actionable information. Because too often that part of our brain that wants research goes out and research, read the books, right? Read the papers. But how do you transform the research into actionable items. And that is where the magic happens. And I talk about this a lot, the discomfort of transformation. So you have to check that out. One last story that I want to share today, guys. We were doing a group Q&A call for Teach Your Kids to Meditate, which is a program that I'm running right now. And we have live group Q&A calls. So if that's something you're interested in, then just go to heatherchauvin.com/kids, KIDS. And so Teach Your Kids to Meditate is not about teaching your kid to meditate so much. We can teach mindfulness and integrate this into our child's life, but it's more about understanding, why we want our child to do what we want them to do, and where in our life do we feel out of control emotionally? Where in our life are we not setting up systems and strategies and those actionable items to create the ease, the emotional freedom that we crave? These are things that we have to go for. So one of the moms got on and she was talking about her child who has intense sensory stuff going on, full-time help. She's doing everything under the sun to help her child. And she was talking about, how can I integrate mindfulness when I can't get him to sit? And I said, don't worry about, meditation as a whole. Don't worry about mindfulness as a whole. Worry about, looking at your son, seeing your son for who he is, and realizing, how can I? Right? How can I, not who can I, how can I support my son in helping him learn mindfulness and feel in control of his big emotions? And so we came up with some creative solutions and action steps, which was actually the complete opposite of what society tells us with meditation and mindfulness, which is, her son was so active in movement. I said, put some headphones on him and allow him to run around the room. And actually headphones were going to bother him. So it was like, great, play a meditation or mindfulness in the room and allow him to vigorously run around the room. Or she had some special headphones. We have to get creative with our health. So, calling this episode on how to get rid of disease, I'm like, how to make disease disappear. That's what it was called. That's the book of this physician, How to Make Disease Disappear. He talks about the 4 pillars. We have to realize that disease it will manifest in the body, it will manifest in the mind, but it is actually dis-ease. It is the opposite of ease that we crave in our life. And more importantly than that, we have to ask ourselves, it's not about fixing the problem. It's not about finding the cure, right? It's not about getting rid of it, but it's saying, where in my life is it not easy? Where in my life am I not allowing myself to feel the ease? Where in my life am I putting up roadblocks and causing so much more stress than what I need? And this is in your parenting, in your marriage, with your money, your time, your energy. You have to challenge yourself and ask yourself, how can I? What can I do? Not who can fix me. So today's challenge question, where in your life are you seeking help but not getting answers or the right interventions that help you feel better? So where in your life are you seeking help but not getting answers or the right interventions that are helping you feel better? So example, you want to feel better in your body. You want to start working out, right? So you need to get stronger physically. So you go to the gym and you're like, ugh, I hate it here, right? But you go and then you go home, you're like, oh my God, I feel so amazing. But what if you went to the gym and you went home, you're like, oh, I just don't feel good. This isn't right, right? This isn't right. You have to start asking yourself, is this a right fit for me? So just going back to that story of what I said about that mother with her son, does this work for me? Does this work for my child? Does this work for our family? Just because you're consulting with somebody doesn't mean they're going to have the answers for you. Just because you're asking your doctor a question doesn't mean they're going to have the answers for you. When I'm working with my clients, I always say this is a co-creation. This is me and you working together to say what works, what fits, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what's working, what's not working. So remembering your challenge question, where in your life are you seeking help but not getting answers that help you feel better? And knowing that if you are not feeling good and it doesn't feel like it's going in the right direction, you, yes, you have control over your life, and you need to take the action to make shit happen. So thank you guys so much for listening to me rant today. It actually feels very weird to be live on Instagram and recording a podcast, because I usually do this with nobody else listening. So there is another element to it. So if I was jabbering a little bit, thanks for, putting up with me. If you haven't already, definitely download the podcast, listen to it if you're listening on Instagram. And if you are a podcast listener and you are listening to this wherever you listen to podcasts, then please, please, please head on over to iTunes and rate and review so that more women, moms, and human beings can start to feel in control of the life that they truly want to be living. All right, guys, talk soon.